It's Benjamin Chesser again. And this is presentation numero 4, number 4, for Math 345. This presentation is on 18th century mathematics in Europe. And I want to start out this presentation with wrapping up the 17th century in Europe. So the 17th century, the latter half, could be defined by expansion, wars, colonization, exporting and importing precious metals. Trade is booming, as we saw in the last presentation. So a lot of activity. Science is beginning to have a broader audience. More people are becoming more and more interested in scientific material, beginning in the latter half of the 17th century, thanks in part to, or mostly to, I should say, the institutions, the Paris Academy and the Royal Society of London. These two institutions' primary purpose was to do scientific research and report their conclusions to the public. So a lot of people became interested in science thanks to these institutions. So the ending of the 17th century, math. There's major developments in calculus. We'll see in a second, but some of them were just consolidating and generalizing previous works on tangents and areas. Fundamental theory of calculus appears. And then the major mathematicians who contributed to this were Newton, Leibniz, L'Hopital, and the Bernoulli brothers. I find it really interesting that Bernoulli is like such a common name in math. Like their family did so much. It's kind of crazy. Makes my family look pretty bad. So Newton developed concepts such as fluxion and fluent. Consolidated, he was the one mostly, it was due to him mostly to like consolidate and generalize the previous works on tangents and areas. He was working off of previous mathematicians like Isaac Barrow and James Gregory, like we mentioned in the previous presentation, who traveled all throughout Europe and kind of gathered and organized everything. But Newton was able to use this work and form it into a problem-solving tool, something that James Gregory and Isaac Barrow could not do. He also worked off people like John Wallis and Johannes Kepler in developing his new concepts. Leibniz, we have him to thank for the fundamental theorem of calculus. He applied, so he had a slightly different approach than Newton. So he developed concepts such as the differential and integral. And then he applied his concept of a differential to the idea of a differential triangle, working off of Pascal's work with the differential triangle. And we have him to thank for the transmutation theorem. Next, the Bernoulli brothers, I could say a lot about the Bernoulli brothers as well. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the 18th century Europe. So this is like the Age of Enlightenment. In the thick of it, there was a move away from monarchical power toward a more democratic structure thanks to John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Larger audience and higher demand of scientific material. This was the Age of Enlightenment because the ideas of the previous 100 years in regards to culture, academia, politics were implemented on a broad scale. So the relatively new fields of calculus and mechanics began to influence thinking about the workings of the universe. Capitalism really takes root in the 18th century Europe. Capitalizing on the previous two institutions that I mentioned, there was other institutions founded in this era, the Berlin Academy, St. Petersburg Academy, and the Turin Society, among many others. And then the publication of academic journals by academies like these and by individuals really made the public, the general public, aware of scientific progress and got them interested in the advancement of science, and it probably influenced some of these mathematicians. So, mathematics in the 18th century. Interestingly enough, there wasn't a huge major development in algebra, but in a lot of other fields of math there were. In algebra, there were just many systematizations made from previous material, so it was just organizing and restructuring. Most important mathematician of this era was Leonhard Euler. He made significant contributions in many fields, including optics, mechanics, artillery, naval science, planetary motion, and several branches of calculus. So this is interesting. He understood first that sine and cosine were solutions to certain differential equations. And he expressed sine and cosine functions as letters and numbers whose relationship to one another could be studied and manipulated using the techniques of calculus. So he's really implementing calculus in regards to sine and cosine. So he led in the area of analysis. That was his biggest contribution. This is extremely interesting as well. Historian Clifford Truesdell has calculated that all of the mathematical and scientific work published during the whole of the 18th century, a full 25% was written by Euler. He did 25% of the work. Let's see. I think Nicholas Bernoulli were the Bernoulli brothers' nephew. So he discovered the notions of total differential and the equality of the mixed second order differential. Maria Agnesi is another super interesting person. She did for Europe in mathematics what I think Thomas Paine did for American politics. In Thomas Paine's work, Common Sense. In that she described the field of analysis in like lamest terms, and in a way that a lot of people could understand it and have a chance to contribute to it or have interest in it. So I thought that was extremely interesting. Her book was called The Foundations of Analysis for the Use of Italian Youth. And she wrote it for her siblings, her little brothers. And then Lagrange is another extremely important figure in this century. He extended the mechanics of Newton, Bernoulli, and Euler, and he also did valuable work in power series. So the fourth slide, last slide, geometry in 18th century Europe. I just found some interesting things on geometry, so I wanted to make it its own slide. So the central thrust in the development of geometry was in its connection to analysis, which was one of the biggest areas of development in the 18th century. And then Clairaut, in his work Elements of Geometry, did kind of what Agnesi did, but in geometry instead of analysis, in that he clearly explained geometry, and he wanted the reader to be curious, and he wanted to encourage the reader's curiosity. So instead of doing like abstract reasoning, he did more like applicable problems and things that required common sense. More interesting examples. And then Gaspard Monge was extremely important as well, and he systematized basic results for both an analytic and differential geometry. And he wrote 2 textbooks for his students at École Polytechnique at the end of the 18th century. And he first presented the point-slope form of an equation of a line. So that is an overview of the ending of the 17th century and the whole of the 18th century mathematics in Europe. Thank you so much for joining and listening. And I love you guys. All right, bye.